Everybody, I think the audience has joined us now. I'd like to welcome you all to the final webinar in our webinar series brought to you by the Autonomy, Disability and Diversity Everyday Practices of Technology project. This is a collaborative Australia Research Council funded project. It's run out of the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, but it's in partnership with a number of service providers and technology partners, both in Sydney and internationally. My name is Shanti Robertson. I'm a chief investigator on the project, but really for today's webinar, I am your host. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the university resides on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and that I'm personally calling in today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So both the Darug and Gadigal peoples have been traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. Many of us who are here today will also be participating from the unceded lands of traditional owners of various nations. So the project team wishes to acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging of the lands where we live and work. So to give you a brief overview of the aims of the webinar series, really what we've sought to do in this kind of time of remote working together is to just take these webinars as an opportunity to bring together both research and industry experts from the project's core research team, but also from our wider networks to discuss some of the critical issues we're collectively grappling with in our work. And the theme for today's webinar is engaging audiences online, representation, diversity and disability. So we're really focusing on the arts and the creative industries today. We've got a fantastic panel of experts with us, and I'm so excited that you could all join us. First of all, we have Seb Chan, who is the Chief Experience Officer at ACME, so that's Australian Centre for the Moving Images. Really great to have you here, Seb. We've got Kane Rosmarin, who's Producer of Public Programs at the Kazula Powerhouse Arts Centre. We have Rachel Kiang, Manager and Curator at Gallery Lane Cove and Creative Solutions. So a really fantastic range of experts from the creative sector. And we also have our very own project lead of the ADEPT project, Associate Professor Karen Soldatic, who is an Associate Professor at the Institute for Culture and Society and the School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. So really brief kind of housekeeping before we kick off. The format of today's webinar is primarily going to be a panel discussion. I'm going to ask a few key, hopefully compelling questions of our panel. But for people out there participating in the audience, if you also have questions or comments, please type them in via the Q&A function. You can type them in at any time during the session. And in the second half of the hour, I'll pull some of these questions from the Q&A for our panel to discuss. And I'll try to cover as many as I can in the time that we have. So, it'd be great to hear your thoughts in the Q&A, and feel free to pop in and type something up whenever you like. You can direct that at a particular panel member or just at the panel more generally. Okay, so I think we'll get started if my panelists are ready to go. Might kind of think about quite a broad question to begin with, and Seb, I might ask you to respond first. If we just think about how, we're engaging diverse audiences using technology, what are the main changes that you're personally seeing in your work in the arts sector at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think it's been an interesting period during the last 6 months. And I think if you'd asked this question to me prior to COVID, I would have had a very different set of answers. And I think in this, I guess, middle of COVID, I guess is how I'd describe it, technology has radically changed how people consume and participate in arts practices across the board. Some of those have made it more accessible to some audiences, and some have made it less accessible. And I think it's introduced more complexity, and it's also revealed some quite sharp disparities within arts organisations around capacity and digital ability and ways of thinking about access in digital media. I think a lot of organisations have been very excited to find that in some cases more people and more diverse people have been able to attend their events and happenings, but at the same time, there's been not enough just discussion about how to make those events and happenings more broadly accessible. So we might have replaced one group's lack of access with another group's lack of access, and I think it is that digital literacy or digital fluency within the sector itself that is still really challenging, and has come to the fore at a time when, of course, money and time is very, very scarce for people to skill up fast.
Yeah, thanks, Seb. It really has been that kind of intense sort of pressure of this period for things to transform really quickly. So Karen, what about you? You know, you're across this maybe in a different capacity to Seb. So what do you think? What are the main changes you've been seeing in the arts sector this year?
I think, as Seb was saying, one is actually about being a member of the Diversity Arts Australia Board. One area really is about capacity of the sector to deliver via technology to diverse audiences. So, you know, historically, you know, a lot of the advocacy has actually been about representation within the arts. So, you know, performers, the kind of arts that are actually consumed by the audience, making sure that we've got diverse representation there. But actually this has kind of flipped it in some ways. So yes, maintaining the pressure to ensure that we have diversity within the arts, particularly the labour force and so forth, and, you know, the kinds of work that's curated. But actually now we have this other issue, and that is, you know, how do we ensure that it's delivered in a way that it's accessible, and accessible in terms of, you know, things like we've got today, such as Auslan interpreters and captioning. So there's a whole new range of interfaces there. And even, you know, like us talking about these webinars, you know, making sure we record in the right format. So the Auslan interpreters are always in that recording. So there's a whole range of, you know, big picture skills that needs to occur, and also, you know, minor technical detail to ensure that, you know, this creation that we're making through this technology is always accessible. So it's about the longevity as well of these pieces that we're creating at this time. So I think there's a lot going on. There's a lot of change, and it has been a highly intensified space. And I think, as Seb has said, one of the real issues is, you know, the upskilling of the sector itself, and to ensure that representation, not just in terms of content, which has been the historical narrative around the arts, but also in terms of access around consumption and participation.
I think that question of access, you know, really does lead to my next question. And I'd really like to hear from Kane and Rachel, as, you know, leaders who have been managing art spaces during this period of kind of transformation. What's kind of been happening with your engagement with your audiences and your communities at Cazula and at Gallery Lane Cove? What's been changing for you guys since adopting more technology, like whether that's this year or even earlier? I might start with Kane.
Well, thank you for the question as well. But I think as generally with digital technologies, we've seen an increase on people coming online, but as well it's obviously changed, but it also hasn't. What it's kind of changed is how we tailor programs now, rather than before we would do a mass marketing kind of thing to our community for access programs and everything else. We now have more tailored programs where we work with our clients to deliver in-person kind of stuff. So that's kind of changed how we do things, which isn't necessarily digital, but it's kind of been affected because of the digital. So that's something that has changed, but I'll also let Rachel talk because I can go on and on.
Yeah, Rachel, what about you?
So for us, particularly during that period of shutdown, you know, we had to pivot online very quickly. And what we did was we developed a suite of digital only internet-based exhibitions while no one can access the gallery. And as a result of that, we found that we've got a different range and reach of audiences, both within and without Australia. And because a number of these projects were also call-out based, it was interesting to see that there were people, a small segment, but there were artists with certain disabilities that also then participated in the call-out, which they may not otherwise perhaps have done if it were an in-person exhibition.
So there's actually opportunity for broadened accessibility there, both for audiences and practitioners and creative people, I guess. The next question is a bit of a speculative one, and that's sort of around that tension between the digital and the face-to-face in the creative industries. Can the digital ever truly replace face-to-face programming and content and engagement? Any thoughts there? Rachel, I might throw back to you. Like, what do we kind of lose, it may be, in the transition to a more digital delivery?
I don't think that the digital can completely phase out, in-person engagements, just because until we reach a stage where we can be wearing haptic suits to experience exhibitions and have the full, gamut of senses. For example, if you have a sense-based or a smell-based or touch-based exhibition, which you wouldn't have during COVID, but assuming if you do, and it's safe to do so, it's a little bit hard to replicate that, through an online-only format. And I've taken the liberty to interpret digital in the sense as taking everything online. But what certainly can happen is that the digital deliveries can enhance, or digital formats can enhance, the audience experience, whether it be through a hybrid of, an exhibition and public program delivery that uses both platforms, for instance, rather than just, a mono platform, if you like. And I think the person probably with a lot of experience in this area with a lot to comment on would be Seb.
Yeah, I'll go to you next, Seb. Do you have any thoughts on that, around the role that the digital can really play and the kind of advantages to digital versus face-to-face?
Yeah, look, I think digital is just different. It brings a different set of affordances. And I think what's been interesting during this period of rapid acceleration is that those differences have played out in a range of ways. So, for example, I don't necessarily see things like academic conferences or academic symposiums returning to face-to-face, because that works actually very well online. And I've sat through many excellent Zoom presentations that I would never have seen, simply because I wouldn't have had the time or the ability to, or the financial ability or the access to travel to participate in those. And I think what we will see, and we are seeing, are artists and creators making things which assume digital connectivity now, which is something that particularly the performing arts has historically steered away from. And I think what we're starting to see is really that, if I ask my children, what is the difference between your digital life and the rest of your life, they would say there isn't one. And I think that's starting to come out in creative practice now too. And so what will happen, I believe, is that there will be more hybridized creative practice occurring across all fields. Whereas I think before it was happening in a subset of creative practice, now it will spread across things that I think we felt weren't best done in that way. So, I've started to see dance performances that occur both across physical and in a virtual space. In fact, we hosted one at work just the other day with Lu Yang, a Chinese artist who was doing a performance as part of Asia Topa. She was performing from Shanghai. Well, her performance was a dancer who was dancing in real time and real space, who was mapped into a virtual video game world that was then streamed out to people around the globe, and that access wasn't previously available, and it was a different type of work. But what coming back to the challenges that brings, though, is that for audiences as well as creators, it requires audiences to have different types of skills and access to technology, connectivity, and basic literacies around how to use all these platforms. There's been so many things I've needed to sign up for that I have never read the privacy policies of, and they're far too long for me to read those privacy policies. So I just click yes and accept. And the economics of that is quite problematic, potentially. I think we'll get to some of the ethical pieces around that later. And the other thing, of course, is at the creators side is what are we providing the access affordances in sort of interpreters, captioning, and other accessibility affordances with those events? And are we, for example, providing transcripts afterwards to make those recorded events? Because obviously when they're digital, they can be recorded and persistent. That's the other thing I think is really quite exciting, is if I miss that event in Shanghai, I should be able to watch it in a week's time. And that changes how we think about live performance. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both.
So yeah, that idea of our live performance taking on a different meaning is quite a significant one, really, quite transformative. What do you think, Kane? Are you seeing, are you starting to reflect a little bit on whether the digital is going to be a mode that continues to take over and what that might mean?
Well, I think, yeah, I think it is here to stay. So it's also generally, digital is not there to replace the live performance. And I think that actually has to be kind of clear that it can never replicate face-to-face, and the best kind of digital programs are created specifically with the digital in mind. So, and I think it is when you create any kind of program, you're thinking about who that audience is and what that audience is going to get, and then kind of feeding that around it and what that outcome looks like. And so you take into consideration all the other things that you would for a face-to-face program. It's the outcome is different. And I think now people are just getting, before when it was lockdown, people were kind of just kind of replicating face-to-face. And now, because Australia is kind of opening up, it's now about how can we create programs that complement what we do face-to-face. And that's what's been really, for me, the exciting thing. And that's kind of some of the really interesting things that you kind of see what's happening, particularly with performance. It was last week, I think it was, somebody created a GIF of a dance. And for me, that's like a really interesting way to take live performance and dancing and take something that is also everyday kind of technology and everyday kind of meme and modern day kind of stuff and make it accessible to an audience that might not necessarily even see contemporary dance as accessible. So that's something that's quite interesting, but it also generally brings to questions about privacy and like what you're signing up to, but which we'll get to. But that's also kind of because you're giving your phone numbers and cookies and all of that kind of stuff. And we'll get to that. So I think it's a thing that complements it. It's not something that exists one or the other.
Love the idea of a GIF of a dance performance. I love a good GIF. I just wanted to note that Seb has shared the recent Lu Yang performance at ACME in the chat. So there's a link there if people are interested, which is really good. And I wanted to take a moment as well to just remind our audience that we would really welcome some questions from you in the Q&A. I've only got a few more things that I'm going to ask the panelists, so please get in there. And there is no question too big or too little. Feel free to type it in and we'll get to them shortly. Okay, so I think we've already brought up a couple of times in some of your responses questions around access and accessibility, and absolutely that's like quite core to some of the work that we've all been doing, both collaboratively and in our own organisations. And I think the idea that comes up a lot in this space, and certainly comes up in the Adept work, is the idea of digital literacy and who actually has capacity to participate when things move online. So I just wanted to get a sense from some of our panel about the role digital literacy might play here in terms of promoting creative engagement with diverse audiences, and whether there are barriers to the move for digital working for everybody. So Seb, I might kind of get your thoughts on this one first.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'll post a link to the recent digital inclusion in Academics report that was just done by RMIT, Swinburne and Telstra. This happens every year. It's a very good breakdown of how access is different across different across Australia, and it really varies across access, affordability, and digital ability, and between age, rural and urban. State by state, there's huge challenges, which I think many of us had hoped were getting better, but I think what COVID has done is just drawn more attention to that gap. You know, as the report says, you know, there's still, you know, 2 million Australians without sufficient access, and I think that's one of the challenges as things move more on a kind of line, is the divide becomes clearer. And the other thing is, you know, that our ability to do what we would have thought was daily activities becomes very challenged. You know, we've also seen that with the move away from cash that COVID has brought as well. There are these trade-offs that are occurring, and there's not much opportunity for us as a community to discuss those, because everything has moved at such a pace. But I'll post a link to the report in the chat.
Yeah, fantastic. There's some great stuff coming through the chat, actually. And yeah, that index report is a really significant one, because it's just got so much good comprehensive data on digital inclusion. So I might get your thoughts on that kind of question now, Kane, because I guess Casula is serving a very diverse community and really diverse audiences. So what's the role of digital literacy in some of the programs that you've been running?
I think it's huge. I think when, you know, like, our community is incredibly diverse, and when you're working with a CAL community whose language particularly is, their first language isn't English, how a lot of the kind of stuff that you're communicating is online is in English, so you have to kind of be aware of what kind of information you're giving to, but as well in terms of access. We've been working with a local school, and just to give context, only 5% of the students have access to digital devices, be it computers, anything. So that's like probably the opposite of what is normally within Sydney. And so when you're working with the community that can't go online, how do you work with them? So you go back to kind of old school tangible ways of connecting with them. So that's what we've kind of been doing. We've been making creativity packs with the schools, with our CALD audiences, and with our seniors, because they don't have access to online. And it's about organizations having to be more conscious of that, and making aware that not all audiences have that access to what you need. And it's kind of been interesting, because we have discussions in the team constantly about how we can do things other than English to our audiences online, and how we can actually also make more tangible physical things, so it's not just the computer. So it's like, that's been fun.
Thanks, Kane. Sounds like there's actually been a lot going on at your end to keep people engaged in the community. And what about you, Rachel? Anything from your end that you wanted to add around the role of digital literacy?
Yes, definitely. So it's probably more in agreement with what Seb and Kane have already raised. You know, when you offer digital programs, you work on certain sets of assumption in terms of access, that, you know, you're able to access the internet, that it's you know, a good speed. If it's completely web-based content, you know, that they have that hardware available. But of course, that's not always the case. And even if they do, they may not necessarily know how to navigate their way through so well. So in our area, we do service a large number of seniors, for instance, and they would almost always prefer to have that sort of physical, real world, in-person contact than anything digital. A very simple example. So we've noticed, for instance, people coming through the gallery, we're now offering two options where, you know, if people don't want to pick up a flyer, they have the option of using QR codes again that leads them to information about the exhibition, you know, on their personal device. But what we find that it's a little bit split. Some people just don't want to go the digital route. Or they might not have, you know, a smartphone that kind of connects with the QR code, for instance. As we know, with all the QR codes being implemented everywhere, it doesn't always work with all phones. Yeah.
So there still is a slightly different experience there for people that have access to the technology and don't necessarily.
Yes.
So I think we'll get to kind of the big, like, sticky question now, which a few of you have already brought up, questions around ethical considerations. So, you know, we've had a few mentions of privacy in online environments, of cookies, of the different dimensions of people's engagement online that you have to consider when you're not doing something in real time or face-to-face. So I might start with you, Kane. What have you been thinking around the ethical considerations for organisations like yours as you start to implement more digital practice?
Thank you. I think we kind of, sorry, that was just my mother phoning me, who I actually think is on here as well.
Okay.
She can be embarrassed about that. I think there's kind of a huge question, not only for us organisations, but all organisations are being held to more accounts across the board now. So we kind of, there is a huge need, particularly within our organisation. We talk about what are we getting people to sign up to? Do they even want to kind of, should we even be pushing them to sign up to something? What kind of data are we gathering? And I think it's kind of a field that particularly us organisations haven't had to consider as much, because they haven't had to do as much online. They haven't had to have as much digital literacy as they do now, particularly one like Casula and regional centres like ours. So it's something that's kind of growing and developing. And I think I have more, but it'll come to me in a bit, so I'm going to pass it on. My mother distracted me.
Seb, what about you? You know, from the kind of ACME experience, like what are the discussions around ethics been like there?
Look, I think we talk a lot about the trade-offs that people need to make when they access our services and our content and our activities. And some of those are ones that we have agency in when we host them on our own website, and whether we collect an email address, or more problematic, because email addresses are very easy for us to generate new ones of. The really problematic piece of personal identity information now is actually a phone number. People don't change their mobile phone numbers very often, and you'll notice that lots and lots of apps and websites are actually asking for that. You know, I think there's you know, I think historically people are like, oh, phone number, fine, I'll just give that. And actually that is more identifying than pretty much anything else right kind of now. And so it's that sort of I guess what I would call security literacy or data literacy that is very poorly, is generally poor across our communities. People are not quite aware of just how the economics of digital platforms work and where money is made, and how money is made. So when arts organisations use free platforms, it's often the end user who is watching that performance or participating in it that is paying through their data, their behavioural data too at times, being recorded and sold for other purposes. And it gets back to some of the things we said earlier, that a lot of times organisations themselves don't have the literacies to be able to make those choices. And all these things move so fast that it is very difficult, even when you're deep in these spaces, to keep up. And that's something, I guess at my museum, we are the National Museum of Screen and Culture. So we are interested in growing that, a range of digital and related literacies within our communities. We have been developing a series of programs around that, which perhaps ironically may be delivered through those very platforms that we might be critiquing, but let's hope not. But it is that piece that often those who have most at risk from being surveilled are also the ones who are most vulnerable to surveillance. And digital technologies are very good at surveillance, and their whole economic model is unfortunately in the last decade moved to being one around data capture and data sharing. I'll actually just post a nice article from a critical digital magazine called Real Life Mag in the US. There was a great piece about called the kind of subscriber city, that talks about what it means when your city requires you to have an app to do anything, from get a driver's kind of license to check into a restaurant, to order food. What that means for what the implications of that actually are. And those are the sort of things I think we need as a community to have more conversations about. And it's also one that I think arts organisations need to be active participants in, rather than waiting for a recommendation report or a white paper on best practice. Why are all those papers white anyway? But anyway, that aside, I think there is, there is a need now that arts and culture is needing to engage with these other sectors, that they actually do engage with them, and it becomes a discussion. And that's not to say that artists aren't also very, very good at poking at these questions. I'll just post this link in the chat.
Thanks, Seb. I mean, I think what you've raised there at the end is really interesting, because in a lot of ways, the artistic community is in a position to critique some of these economies of surveillance and data extraction, and to use creative practice to contribute to that critique, which they're doing, and it's really interesting. But then the creative industry and the creative sector, like most sectors, is also often dependent on these platforms to engage and work with their audiences. So there are these really kind of interesting critical discussions that I think that can be had in the arts and creative industries around some of these ethical questions. And in some ways, I think, you guys can have them in a more interesting and creative way potentially than other types of sectors. So Karen, what about you, as someone who has done a lot of, really critical research around the ethics of technology, particularly for people who are living with disability or people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. What are your thoughts on the ethical considerations for arts organisations in particular?
Well, I think, as Seb said, one of the real issues is going to be weighing up what are going to be the compromises between, you know, dissemination, audience participation and inclusion, and the kinds of platforms that they actually have to sign up to. But I think also too, it really comes back to the bigger issues that we were talking about before as well, in terms of digital literacy. You know, how are we going to communicate? What are the risks of being involved in these platforms? And, you know, I mean, there is the issue around disability, accessibility and inclusion, and laying out what those ethical risks are by engaging in those platforms in a way with language that it is accessible. And then there's also other issues around, you know, the age of the cohort. Like I think of my father and, you know, we constantly have to ring him up and say, did you know you posted that on Facebook? And he has absolutely no idea how these technologies work. And then I think of other communities where, you know, these comprehensive ethical guidelines around participating in these platforms, but they really don't, you know, the way the language is used. There's a whole range of new words that are specific to the technologies themselves that, you know, people don't really have a full understanding of, or even the idea of data capture, like what does that actually mean? So I think what's going to happen over time is that organisations, creative organisations, are going to have to really develop their own kind of strategies on how to communicate to the audiences that they want to communicate with, what the actual risks are of the different types of platforms that they're utilising. And this might not be platforms that the organisations have developed themselves or the artists have developed themselves, but kind of being some type of intermediary of communicating what the risks are in a way that their audience will understand it. So I think the burden eventually, unfortunately, will fall onto the organisations to communicate that, and that will create its own risks for them as well, in terms of if people will continue to engage because they don't like the way the risks are being communicated, even though it's clearer and they understand it more. But also it also raises, you know, once you start transposing or translating other kinds of risks to, you know, you're the intermediary in that, it means that it creates a number of legal risks for the organisation about, you know, where does responsibility lie if something goes wrong, or the audience, you know, start to withdraw or start to have issues with the way that that's being communicated. So I think it's very complex, and I think there'll be a lot more work in this space, particularly in the creative industries, to ensure that, you know, this you know, our cultural life remains accessible and inclusive.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I mean, there is the kind of question of ethical practice for collectives and groups and organisations, but then there's also the really big question around the actual legalities of some of this stuff, which is pretty pressing and challenging for organisations to grapple with. Okay, I really want some questions in the Q&A. So come on, audience. Kane's mum, if you want to talk to Kane, you can type a question in the Q&A. Anybody else out there? As soon as I get a question, I'll jump to it. So whatever you want to ask, any pressing question on this theme, get in there. You've got a really fantastic panel of experts, so go ahead and pick their brains. But until I get a Q&A, I'll ask one final, like probably quite big picture landscape type question of our panelists. We've raised a lot of really interesting strands today in this discussion, and we've identified, I think, lots of challenges that are quite pressing. So I just wanted to get some final thoughts. What are ways that as a sector, these challenges can start to be addressed? So particularly in terms of diverse audience engagement and participation, what do you see as some really interesting ways forward? I might start with you, Seb, this time.
Look, I think it's difficult right now because the creative sectors and the cultural sector generally across Australia is in such economically bleak situation, and a lot of, particularly the small to mediums, are just trying to survive. And it feels like there will be a quite uneven response across the different states, and certainly at the federal level, to how arts and culture is supported. No surprises, but I wouldn't. I think the only way I can see things getting better in terms of this kind of digital literacies and capacity building is a solid investment in financial and resource investment in that capacity building work, and that capacity building work is done with ethical approaches really right at the forefront of that. And there are emerging signs of that being a desire within the communities. And it's also one that I think arts and cultural organisations can also take that opportunity to rethink more broadly their audience and their relationship with their audiences and their local communities as part of that transformation too. So this shouldn't be about taking the audiences we had and moving them to a digital or hybrid space. That's nowhere near enough. I think arts and culture is part of everybody's lives, but not everybody identifies with or participates in what is seen as arts and the culture by the dominant culture. So this is an opportunity for quite large scale transformation, but it needs policy changes. You know, it really needs policy change and investment. And this is an opportunity, and it's also one I think that the pandemic has shown that there is certainly a demand for, in quotes, cultural content, and there may be some new commercial and corporate partners who want to see, or who also see opportunity here too. But I would hope that we end up with a more diverse and participatory cultural sector, not just a more digitally capable cultural sector. We need both.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, I mean, Kane, what about you? Do you have any thoughts on the kind of call to action, way forward type questions?
I actually think that a way that we can, and I agree with that wholeheartedly, I think it does need to also come through policy changes and how we and funding, but I also think there's through kind of CACD practices, so community arts and cultural development practices, so working with the community to kind of give, like, seeing what their needs and wants are to kind of is something that's really interesting. I can kind of breach that barrier, and something that I think we should be kind of investing more in this kind of era. It's kind of no longer kind of just creating work and hoping an audience comes. It's about building your audience with you, and the audience is a key component of the work that you do in organizations as much as the artist and everything else. And that also brings a host of other stuff, which is also really interesting. So it's like issues, particularly with consent. And so working with all different kinds of communities, how do you bring consent to that table, and what does that look like? So working with school kids, working with people with disabilities, it's ensuring that they as much have their kind of work seen as much as everybody else. And so that's been really interesting, is getting people to tell us what they think is consent as well. Yeah, that's where I think it's going to go.
Okay, I might come back to you, Rachel, on that one, because I've just got a couple of questions from the audience, which I want to make sure we have time to get to, if that's okay. So we have a question from Aileen, which is a really interesting one, which Seb's already responded to. Thank you, Seb. Aileen No, that's great. That's actually fantastic because it means we can get some responses from other panelists, and we've got your response already, which is good. So Aileen said that she's interested in the ethical considerations when working with and presenting artists' work online. What are some considerations that have cropped up or surprised you in the quick shift to online in terms of work and performance that would previously have been experienced live? So that's, I guess, really about the relationship between the artist and the organisation that's presenting the artist, and what the ethical relationship is there between artists and organisations. So we really talked about the ethics of audiences and their participation a bit more before. So that's a really good question. Rachel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so obviously when you present work online, depending on the format and the medium, it makes it more, well, I shouldn't say it makes it easy for it to replicate, but it does. So there are questions around, you know, copyright, and as you've pointed out before, Shanti, depending on the platform that arts organizations use, and most arts organizations, especially the small to medium ones, are not in a position to use tailored software or platforms, then they are kind of at the mercy, so to speak, of these, you know, larger sort of online platform services. So what we had to do in one of our cases, the project, is that we pretty much went through all the terms and conditions with each of the artists and let them know this is the extent to which you know, we can have an agreement with that software company, but beyond that, you know, there is that certain element of risk. Are you prepared to take it or are you not? It's pretty much that. And you know, if you're not, then you know, the question then is, you know, do you still want to be a part of this project? Yeah.
It's about transparency, I guess, from the outset about what's possible. Kane, what about you? Do you have any thoughts there about the ethics of artists and online performance?
I think one of the biggest things actually is like budget for it, right? So like there was this idea that if you go online, that means that the artist will create work and do work like for free. And so I think one of the biggest shifts is that, and that comes from like, I think like a much larger kind of level, is that their work is still needs to be compensated. So you create the artist's work, be it any form of copyright, has to be compensated. And we've had, one of the things that kind of have surprised me is we've just launched our online collection. So going through our collection, making it available online. And I know the registrar had a lot of kind of discussions with our director in relation to the copyright and getting proper sign off from all the artists. And some of them are not alive anymore, and making sure that their work can be like used online for a very specific purpose. Like it can be used for online collection and that's it. And that kind of was quite interesting and surprising, because a lot of us thought, it's going online, it can be used for everything, but it's actually the kind of the things that it's used for is really kind of specific. And that was something that I think is interesting and brings into question kind of the ethical reasons, is that when artists are signing, are they signing for their work to be used on all platforms, or is it a specific platform? And so that's also something that should be considered, particularly in relation to it. And I know the other question is from my father as well. So hi.
I'm actually going to go to that one next, because I think this is a really interesting question that's come through from Doron. And I think we've all sort of experienced a bit of these risks here in the move to a more online professional life this year. How could audience participation ever be truly interactive in real time without censorship, considering the socially incorrect risks? So I guess this is about, if you've got audiences interacting live in a streaming capacity or in a capacity like this, how do you kind of make sure that nothing really inappropriate happens with that audience participation? Anyone have any like interesting or strange stories in this regard, or had any experiences with this?
Oh, I mean, one of the first Zooms that I was in early in the lockdown, this might have been actually before lockdown at the end of February, early March, was a Zoom event, and it was all going really well and great. And then these abusive, racist young people from another country started appearing and started showing parts of their bodies to us. And unfortunately, no one had set up the administrative filters, so it was very difficult to block them. And that obviously has become part of everyone's practice now. But really, as I wrote back in my comment, everything needs moderation. And I think one of the challenges has been that, as someone, I did a lot of the early work in museums around social media and the like. And I think the sector was very bad at realizing well, I don't know, it was bad. I think it was naive. We had very utopian visions of bringing everyone together, and that would be great. It turns out that bringing everyone together without a clear set of commonalities or common codes of conduct are very challenging. And we've seen now in physical conferences too, participants sign up that if they are abusive in any way, they will be taken off the premises. And that sort of community moderation is very, very critical. So we wouldn't tolerate it in our physical spaces. Why should we tolerate it in our digital spaces too? And I think it just becomes, again, a literacy piece and a capacity piece. But it's something when we talk to artists too, and I think going back to the previous question, I think also institutions that commission work or present work by artists, I would suggest need to have an understanding that might exceed the artist around particular platforms, so they can guide the safe and responsible presentation of that work, which may mean a negotiation with that artist to ensure that, yes, this live performance is going to be moderated. I know you don't want that, but if we had it in the venue, it would be moderated. We might have a security guard, or we might have ushers. We've got digital ushers, or perhaps we need to record this event because we need to be able to present it in other time zones to provide that access that we otherwise couldn't do. So there's a negotiation. I think it's that literacy piece, in the kind of balance of knowledge about these platforms and services that is part of what I think needs addressing.
Yeah, so that mediation kind of role is pretty critical. So I think we've only got time for one more audience question, and we do have one which is specifically for Karen. So Karen, if I can just ask for a quick response from you, because it's nearly time to wrap up, but I think this is a really important question to end on. Do you think that disability inclusion is increased in digital platforms or not, and why?
That is a really good question, and some people suggest that it has, and other people suggest that it hasn't. And I think even given our own experience working with these webinars, one of the key issues is about the costs and funding of disability inclusion. And, one of the things that's happened with COVID and the rapid transfer to online. So yes, different galleries and creative spaces have, live streamed their events, and that supposedly makes it more accessible to a divergent audience. But, what happens for the deaf community? And these kinds of costs haven't actually been budgeted for in the delivery, not just because of the rapid online pivot in the way that programs and so forth should be delivered, but also they're not actually budgeted for in the overall program scope from the initial outset. So I don't think we can assume that the idea of something being made digital is going to automatically be accessible. I think, I think for anything to be digitally accessible, it comes back to the points made earlier, that, it needs to be developed from the outset. It needs to be conceptualised as front and centre of the program overall. So that the different types of accessibility, so even things like affordability, what kind of platforms is it going to be delivered on? Is it going to cost people money to sign up? So there's not even the ethical issue around the kind of data capturing and that you have to hand over if it's a free platform, but often these platforms you actually need to pay a fee for. So, and for a lot of people with disabilities, because of their employment situation, they have to make the ethical decision about, if I participate in this cultural event and I have to pay a fee for that, then what does that mean I forego? So, that creates another type of inaccessibility that really hasn't been thought of in that process either. So there's the issue about how is this designed and conceptualized from the very outset, and what kinds of accessibilities have been included in that design, then in that implementation and delivery. And the other issue too is immediate delivery. And the idea of digitisation is it supposedly provides longevity. And as I said earlier, it's also something might be accessible in the moment of delivery as a digital online platform. But what about once it's archived? Will it still have all of those accessibility features that it had at the moment of delivery? So it's not just thinking about immediate accessibility, but also the longevity of that cultural product as well, because often that's where the disability community really misses out. Not just, it's the long-term nature. They can't actually go back to those resources that able-bodied people can. And so we need to think about that as part of the design process in and of itself. And also, how do we budget and finance for that to make sure that it's inclusive over the long term for our audience?
Yes, it's a question of really long-term planning and design, not just of the moment provision of accessibility. Okay, we have come to the end of our time, so we need to wrap it up. I would really like to thank everybody for participating in this webinar, for our audience members for fantastic questions. Really special thanks to our three incredible panelists. I think one thing that the digital has enabled for us today is to get such an incredible and diverse range of expertise all in one room, which is really difficult to do. We know that you're really busy people and your organisations have been facing a lot of challenges this year, so we so appreciate having you to be part of this dialogue and part of our broader community of practice around the ADEPT project. Thank you so much to our wonderful Auslan interpreters from Auslan Services and to our captioners. Our panelists have generously thrown a lot of really great resources into the chat. We will save all of those, and please contact a member of the ADEPT team, like our project manager, Kim Spurway. You can find her email address on our website, and we're really happy to share those resources that have been shared if you didn't have a chance to note things down. But yeah, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.